Kelsey O'Connell. And Kelsey is one of our board of directors members and an executive committee member, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Kelsey?
Yes, thank you very much, Jill. So today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Laura Kudrna, who will talk about the relationships between income and happiness. So Laura is an assistant professor in the Institute of Applied Health Research at the University of Birmingham. Her main research interests are on how to apply psychological and behavioral principles to drive health and well-being improvements, both for individuals and communities. She's particularly interested in income, workplaces, and inequalities. Prior to joining the University of Birmingham, she spent 7 years at the London School of Economics, working toward her master's and doctoral degrees. She then held a postdoctoral post at Warwick Medical School, where she contributed to a cluster randomized controlled trial with small to medium-sized enterprises. And today, Laura is also the core academic lead at the Center for Urban Wellbeing. And pardon me, Laura, if I've got your title wrong, you'll correct us, correct me. And so it's a center which she'll tell us more about shortly. And as the name implies, it's quite relevant to the ISQOLS community. So without further ado, Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you, Jill, and thank you everybody for coming today. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about some work that I've done over the past several years about the relationship between money and happiness. But first, just to say a little bit about the Center for Urban Wellbeing. You're right, Kelsey, I am the core academic lead there for the Wellbeing Economies theme, and I also co-direct the center together with Jessica Pikett. At the center, we're particularly interested in well-being as a property of places as well as people. So really thinking about the contextualized nature of well-being, especially community interventions and meaningful co-production. And having an international perspective on this work is really important. I'm delighted that you've joined our advisory board, Kelsey. Thank you so much. I think it's really important to share learning between places. And with you on board, hopefully the perspective of ISQOLS will meaningfully shape our understanding of well-being and quality of life research in the future, especially considering kind of what we can do to improve well-being at all different levels. So thank you very much for joining. All right, so today I'll be talking about this piece of work that has been going on, as I mentioned, for quite some time, called Money Does Not Always Buy Happiness, but Are Richer People Less Happy in Their Daily Lives? It Depends Upon How You Analyze Income. This particular piece of work began many years ago when I was at the LSE, and at the time I was studying the relative income effect. Those of you who are familiar with happiness research and income will know this is about kind of how the average income in a local area impacts upon how people feel and think about their lives. And as part of this work on relative income, I started to look at absolute individual levels of income and happiness. This is a very well-trodden area, but I did notice that some interesting things were happening when analyzing income. So I contacted Kostin and Kushlev, the co-author on the paper, who was working on one of the same data sets that I was, and he agreed that what I was noticing was interesting. And so we wound up developing this paper together. It's recently been published in Frontiers in Psychology, and I'm very much looking forward to telling you about it and also hearing your views about it. I hope to keep plenty of time for discussion. So in terms of background, it's often assumed that people who have more money have more happiness. To avoid confusion, I'm defining happiness here as hedonic feelings in a utilitarian sense. So if people say that they're feeling happy, if people themselves report that they feel happy. There are, of course, many related constructs in this area. This includes life satisfaction, which is common in much of the economic literature, also eudaimonia, associated with the Aristotelian idea of a virtuous, good, and meaningful life. But here, primarily, the focus is upon if people report that they are feeling happy. There are very good reasons, in theory, to assume that more income will bring about more happiness. In brief, people with more income have the capability to consume more, so even if they choose not to. And this is consistent with Amartya Sen's capabilities approach. People with more income are also able to consume more and thus satisfy more of their preferences in economic terms. Consuming more goods and services tends to be associated with greater utility and greater well-being. But there are some challenges to this idea. So one challenge is the idea of high expectations. Here, it's possible that high expectations that more income will lead to more happiness might cause frustration, perhaps because when people obtain more income, they wind up comparing themselves to others who are doing even better and then not feeling as good as a result. This is something that Carol Graham and colleagues have shown in Peru and Russia. So Carol Nickerson and colleagues show that having goals for financial wealth can actually wind up harming well-being and happiness when they're not achieved, which of course, oftentimes they're not, when people have quite high aspirations. It's also well known in the income and happiness literature that people tend to adapt to higher income and to pay rises. So at first, a pay rise might seem great and boost happiness, but over time, the effects wear off, and people might not expect them to. And so they might be disappointed that happiness boost doesn't last as long as they would like. There are also questions about the quality and quantity of leisure time associated with different income groups. There's some research to suggest that in most developed countries since the 1980s, the well-educated have had relatively less leisure time, and the rich are less satisfied with their leisure time, which is an issue because recent research shows that both too much and too little leisure time is associated with worse well-being. Don't want to have nothing to do, don't want to have too much to do. Research also shows that the rich spend more time alone, which is an issue because quality time with others we like is good for happiness, which is pretty well established in the literature on social capital and also on relational goods. Some, however, have posited that people from working class backgrounds are more generous and empathetic, which may not be good for happiness. And this is because people who are more generous and more empathetic tend to have better relationships with others, and this tends to be good for their happiness and well-being. So if people who are rich are less generous and they're more selfish, then this may not be good for their happiness. However, there's really mixed evidence in this area of research. Finally, there's also the idea that people from working class backgrounds have a more interdependent sense of self. In one of my kind of favorite classic studies by Snibbe and Marcus in 2005, researchers watched people who picked out pens that were either similar or different to what others picked out. And they found that upper class people kind of liked unique pens more, ones that hadn't been picked out by other people before. And this suggests that an interdependent sense of self may differ according to income groups. And again, having a more dependent sense of self and being more relational towards others tends to be good for happiness when we spend time with people that we like. Now, all of this is empirically testable. So what does the evidence say about the relationship between individual income and happiness? So the standard finding, which many of you will be familiar with across many studies, is diminishing marginal utility of income. So more income matters the most to those with the least of it, and the least to those with more of it. So this is a stylized graph showing this relationship, which might be characterized by psychologists as being reflective of something called the Weber-Fechner law of stimulus perception, which interestingly also applies to stimuli like noise. Changes matter less and they're perceived less when there is more going on. When there's more noise, it's really difficult to tell if there's been a change, but if there's less, it's easier to tell a change. And the same with income. However, this does appear to depend upon how happiness is conceptualized and measured. In particular, a famous study that talks about whether or not happiness is conceptualized and measured either as an overall evaluations of one's life or as daily emotional states. What do we mean by evaluation? If you look on the slide at the bottom on the left, the first measure is a ladder scale, which asks people to rate where they're considering kind of the best and worst possible lives for themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. And this is the measure used in the Gallup Healthways Wellbeing Index, which is a daily survey of around 1,000 US residents analyzed by Kahneman and Deaton in 2010. The other measure in this survey is if people experienced various emotions yesterday, kind of overall, such as enjoyment, happiness, anger, sadness, stress, and worry. And they did not find that this diminishing relationship held for all measures. And you should be able to see that now in the graph on the right. If you look there at the bold line kind of in the middle for the ladder related to evaluations, that number 1 measure, the story of diminishing marginal utility kind of does appear to hold, kind of tapers off at the top. But for positive affect, so how people feel, those enjoyment, happiness, anger, sadness, stress, and worry, reflected by positive affect, negative affect, not blue, and feeling stress-free. At higher levels of income, according to this graph, the relationship seems to kind of flatten out rather than to slowly diminish. And they call this a satiation point. And the satiation point was around 75K annual income per year in the United States. And this finding was widely covered by the press, and it changed kind of what people did. Some of you may have seen the BBC News article about a company in Seattle that listened to this. The director of the company decided to pay himself less and to pay his employees more. He put everyone on 70K. In this particular article, he kind of laughingly comments that he misinterpreted the study. He thought that the point was 70K rather than 75K. But this is something that did influence what people did to a significant degree. I do wonder if this company would have decided differently, based on more recent research. In another study published just this year, Killingsworth used a different sample and challenged the conclusion by Kahneman and Deaton of a satiation point. In this study, they looked at evaluative measures of life satisfaction, which is typical, but instead of asking people to recall their happiness yesterday, he used smartphone data where participants' smartphones were signaled at random times of day. And this is a really important method called experience sampling because people do not always remember very well how they felt in previous days. Their emotions aren't always accurately recalled. And so when their phones were beeped, they were asked kind of how they felt right now on a scale ranging from very good to very bad. And you can see the results of this study in the graph on the right. The results showed no satiation point. In this graph, well-being kept rising even with higher income. Now, although ESM experience sampling methodology data do have the strength that they are less likely to be affected by recall bias, one of the weaknesses of ESM data, particularly in this study, is that it's from a self-selected sample of people who can use smartphones and answer beeps. It doesn't take as much effort to ensure representation from differently motivated people as household surveys or surveys like the Gallup. There's not as much effort to, knock on doors and make these phone calls when people don't answer. It's just a beep and then it's gone. And so the evidence in terms of it being representative is perhaps kind of less persuasive than household surveys, which is what previous research has focused on. There are ways in household surveys to improve representativeness. So if you go to household surveys, kind of looking at data on momentary happiness, oftentimes what they'll have is something called a time use diary. One from the UK is shown below in pink there. This is a screenshot of how the data is collected in something called the UK Time Use Survey. In the UK Time Use Survey, people are asked to identify what they did yesterday according to activities with natural start and stop times. You can see kind of on the left, on the bottom, in the morning there, such as waking up their children or having breakfast. And they might have multiple activities, report on if they were using technology or where they were. And on the right, in the UK, participants were asked if they enjoyed this activity. There are comparable studies in the US and Germany that asked more specifically about happiness rather than enjoyment. And again, this helps to prevent recall bias by refocusing the mind on the activities of every day, but it can still use representative sampling methods because it's embedded in a larger household study where there are many attempts made to contact participants. So what do we find using this day reconstruction method from household time surveys? In previous research, there's no evidence of a relationship between income and happiness in the US and Germany. And this has been shown in multiple studies. Just last year, more recently, a negative relationship was found in the UK. So the idea that people with higher incomes felt less happy. So it's clear here that the measure does seem to impact upon the outcomes. Now, it's important to say that this is a very small selection of a very wide literature. I will say that there have also been many longitudinal studies on individual income and happiness. Previously, I've just been talking about kind of snapshots at one point in time. There's also been data from field experiments where people are randomly assigned to be given money, or lotteries, for example. We are currently talking about the individual level, but there's also global data, including on the Easterlin paradox, which Kelsey has conducted some important work on recently, looking at GDP and life evaluations. So, for example, finding a positive association in the cross-section, but no change over time, even though GDP increases. And there are healthy debates about the existence of satiation points and also turning points, where at their top, there might be a negative relationship between income and happiness at higher levels of income, kind of looking at global data. There are also studies on the relative income effect, classically with Lutmer, that the higher the average income in a local area, controlling for own income, the worse that people evaluate their lives, perhaps due to social comparisons, but this can also depend upon the distribution and equality of income, people's hope and future opportunities, if there are public goods available and these are controlled for or not, like schools or parks in the area, and so on. But today I'm really talking about a very small portion of this literature and a very small contribution, kind of looking at snapshots at the individual level. There is value in snapshots. They do have a long tradition in public health for understanding the distribution of advantage and disadvantage in terms of health, thinking about risk and protective factors, and also targeting interventions. And I think there are lessons that can be applied kind of from what public health does for happiness science. So one of the things that I noticed in the literature and in the data about income and happiness is that the way in which income is, first of all, measured, and it differs between data sets. Let's take the American Time Use Survey, which is conducted in the United States. It's a repeated cross-sectional survey. And this survey asks people about income using a question that is drawn from the current population survey. And this particular question you can see here asks people to report their total combined income during the past 12 months in categories and buckets from 1 to 16, going from less than $5,000 all the way up to $150,000 or more. So people are asked essentially to categorize their income. And that's one common way that income might be collected. It can be difficult for people to remember a specific number. So why don't we ask them to put it in categories or into big buckets? But alternatively, compare this to a survey called the German Socioeconomic Panel. Again, a very common survey for understanding happiness and patterns over time. Here, the question is quite different. People are asked their gross and net income and to report it as an integer value, so without categories. So they're asked essentially to report it in continuous form. So the way that data about income is collected in these different surveys, and it differs right at the point of the survey instrument. Looking at existing literature, we also have differences in the analytic approach used to investigate the relationship between income and happiness. So if you look at what Kahneman and Deaton did in 2010, they used regression and they looked at different groups, kind of looking at differences in mean outcomes. If you look at what Killingsworth did more recently in 2021, he did piecewise regression, looking at income groups, but differences in slopes within the groups. We look at what Sachs, Stevenson, and Wolfers have done. They used regression splines, which is very similar to piecewise regression, but again, it's about kind of these knots and differences before and after these knots in different groups. And then we have Jeb et al. Again, they were using global data, and they used a non-parametric approach called lowess regression. So differences in the way that income is collected, and also differences in the way that income and happiness are kind of measured and analyzed. So the key aim of this work in terms of its contribution is primarily methodological. The idea is that the relationship between income and happiness may depend not only on how happiness is measured, as in previous work, but also on how income is measured and analyzed, given the fact that there are differences in results between studies and different approaches. So in this work, we focus on nonlinearities in the relationship between income and happiness, and we reanalyze the American Time Use Survey data used by Kushlev and Stone, as well as the German Socioeconomic Panel data used by Hudson et al., which produced really similar conclusions of no relationship between income and experiential happiness in these data. And I think it's particularly interesting to focus on experiential happiness data from day reconstruction methods, those time use diaries, and also from experience sampling, because, as I've said, they're less prone to recall bias. I also think they're more aligned with the mental state account of well-being. So something like life satisfaction, it sounds a bit like preference satisfaction in a way, which is something that's often used by economists. But I think happiness and kind of momentary utility is something that's more aligned with the philosophical literature around understanding how people feel, this mental state account. So in this work, when we're focusing on these kind of really experiential measures, the idea is, differently to previous work, to treat income in ATIS, the American Time Use Survey, as it was measured. Originally, it was a categorical variable with 16 categories, but previous work kind of finding no relationship between income and happiness in ATIS treated it as a continuous variable in the analyses, even though it's categorical in terms of its original measurement form. And we initially focused on American Time Use Survey data. We were then asked to include data as well from another source. So we included the German Socioeconomic panel as well. As I showed earlier, in the German Socioeconomic panel, the original measurement form of income was continuous. To make it comparable to the American Time Use Survey, we recoded the continuous measure of income into 16 categorical quantiles, just so we could compare the 16 different categories and the continuous measures in each data set. And we conduct different analyses of these income in both continuous and categorical forms. So I've talked a little bit about ATIS already. The American Time Use Survey is a repeated cross-sectional data set. We looked at the data from 2010, 12, and 13, so it's older data. We picked comparable data from the German Socioeconomic panel from 2012 to 2015. This is a longitudinal survey, but we analyze it as cross-sectional to keep it consistent with the ATIS. And we also include data from the experience sampling model in the German Socioeconomic panel. So we have ESM data from Germany, and then we also have day reconstruction method data from Germany and also from the United States. We analyzed data from nearly 34,000 individuals in the American Time Use Survey, nearly 7,000 individuals in the German day reconstruction method diary sample, and only around 249, 250 individuals in the German experience sampling method. It can be quite difficult to get those people to respond to those beeps on their phones, as I've mentioned. And the outcome measure is happiness. In ATIS and GSUP, from the time use diaries, a random selection of 3 activities was taken and people were asked how they felt during them. We focus on the happiness item, although people in both data sets were asked about other measures of how they felt. For example, in ATIS, they were also asked about stress and sadness, but really we're wanting to focus on differences according to how income is measured and analyzed, rather than differences according to the outcome measure of happiness. All of the data is publicly available, and this data do file is available to download with the publication on Frontiers. And so it's possible to check the analyses or run modifications if you would like to do so. In the analyses, we take the average of happiness across all activities each day to create an individual level measure. The GSIP DRM sample contained multiple observations for individuals across the years. Therefore, we clustered the standard errors at the individual level, but didn't do anything fancy in terms of fixed or random effects because we wanted to model it similarly to the ATIS and keep it in cross-sectional form while still adjusting the standard errors. We conducted regression analysis of income, both in its continuous form across both data sets, looking at log, quadratic, and categorical approaches. And we report omnibus F tests and effect sizes. We also conduct both kind of non-parametric lowess and spline regressions. We do include some control variables. All of our analyses are reported without and with controls. We tried to use the same control variables in both data sets. As you can see, of course, for the outcome, both data sets have happiness. And for the main independent variable, both data sets have income, and we include it in continuous log, quadratic, and categorical form. We also include controls for age, gender, marital status, and ethnic background. For ethnic background in the ATIS, this was Hispanic or Black, whereas in Germany, in GSUP, it was German origin. For health, we include physical health or cognitive difficulty and self-rated general health, depending upon the data set. We also include employment data set and status, number of children in the households, and whether or not the diary day was a weekend, because happiness could potentially differ between weekday and weekends. All right. In terms of our results, our effect sizes generally range from around 0.06 to 0.37. This is not large, but I think it's important to emphasize that this is generally not out of magnitude for experienced well-being. So the effect size for the relationship between age and daily experiences of happiness was around 0.16 in a well-known paper by Arthur Stone in 2010. I'm looking at the age and its relationship with experienced well-being measures. So our effect sizes are small, but they're in the range for what would be expected for the relationship between kind of the circumstances of life with how people feel. In the analyses, we focus on coefficients, their magnitude, the variability, so 95% confidence intervals, and visualizations of these coefficients and their confidence intervals, but we do not report on statistical significance, which is keeping certainly with thinking in public health, more recently in psychology, with this idea that we really want to be talking about kind of magnitude and variability rather than chasing a p-value, which tends to lose its importance and value, especially when there are many observations like in these data sets. The GSIP happiness outcome was transformed to be on a 0 to 6 scale, very similar to ATIS. Initially, I think it was 1 to 7, and then we transformed it so that all of our results are on a 0 to 10 scale. So what did we find? First, let's start with the results from the American Time Use Survey and from the day reconstruction method sample within it. And we found very little evidence of any relationship between income and happiness for either linear, quadratic, or log income. You can see on the screen there, the coefficients are very small and they're not particularly precise. In terms of our omnibus F test as well, this hovered around 1 or less, which suggests, as has been found in previous research, very little evidence of any relationship between income and happiness. However, if we switch over to the American Time Use Survey, if we switch over to looking at it as categorical within the American Time Use Survey, you can see that it doesn't look like necessarily that there's no relationship. Instead, our attention was drawn to a particular category of income. So those who earned 35 to 40K. And if we compare that particular group with other income groups, it appears that there are some substantive differences between that group and those who have higher income. So for example, the size of the difference between those who have 35 to 40K versus 150K plus of income is around 0.16 with a 95% confidence interval of 0.8 to 0.24, which is not out of the realm of the substantive kind of size of magnitude there. And remember that this is the original measurement form of the American Time Use Survey income variable. However, the omnibus test for categorical income, still the F hovers around 1, which suggests not much of a substantive relationship. Moving on to looking at analyses of ATIS DRMs in lowess regressions, we find very little evidence of any relationship. You can see that the line itself is between 4.3 and 4.4, which is very little evidence of any relationship at all. Even when we're looking at kind of very small magnitudes of effects, this is very small. And there wasn't much of an evidence of any substantive relationship in the regression splines as well. So the overall pattern there here would suggest a null result. Moving on to results from Germany, from the GSIP DRMs, if we look at income in its continuous form, which again is the original form in GSIP, there was little evidence of any relationship looking at linear, quadratic, or log income. The most substantive and precise was for log income with controls, and it was still a really small and uncertain size, negative 0.08 with a confidence interval that crosses 0. So not something that we would consider any evidence of any relationship. Interestingly, the association was stronger and more precise and negative when equivalizing income, so dividing by the square root of the household size, a coefficient of around 0.16. However, we didn't equivalize income in both data sets due to the categorical nature of the income variable in ATIS. So little evidence of a relationship in continuous form. What about categorical? So again, if we look at GSIP DRMs, looking at categorical income, our attention might be drawn to, say, the third quantile, if you look on the left there, that appeared happier than some of those both lower and higher in income. For example, they appeared happier than those in quantile 13 with around 42K. We created 16 kind of even quantiles of the income there. The omnibus test for categorical income in this case was 4, a bit higher, but still not particularly substantive. Interesting, though, that the omnibus F test changed from previously, if you go back, looking where it was around kind of 1, hovering around 1 up to 4, when you simply switch the way in which the income variable kind of is measured and analyzed. Finally, similar to ATIS, there was very little evidence of any relationship in lowess or spline regressions. Again, just hovering between 2.8, 2.9, very little difference there. In the GSIP experience sampling, where there was only around 250 people, each person has a dot there, weren't able to do anything other than the non-parametric analyses. But again, we would conclude that there's very little evidence of any relationship between income and happiness in the GSIP ESMs. Right, so considering those results, what can we take from these? Is income in these data sets at least a signal for how happy people feel, or is it simply noise? We think that categorical income, when looking at that kind of conceptualization and measurement, there is some evidence that people with higher income feel less happy than some of those with lower incomes, but we do not find that this is observed when treating income in its continuous form and considering various transformations of it. And I think there are at least 3 possible interpretations of this pattern of results. And I'd like to thank Professor Richard Lilford for this insight. He leads many trials aiming to improve health and well-being and deals with this issue of multiple comparisons quite a bit. So according to the conservative interpretation, there would be no relationship between income and happiness in these data. And the reason for that is that we conducted so many comparisons and transformations, we are bound to simply find something. And if we had been using p-values, we should have perhaps corrected them using Bonferroni or something else, and we might not have found anything at all. So conservatively, no relationship between income and happiness. A more generous interpretation rests on the idea that all of our income measures were correlated, and thus, because they're dependent, there would be no need for correction for multiple comparisons or transformations. So generously, every relationship that we found should be something that's substantive. A more moderate interpretation, and the one we adopt, is something that's in between. So there's some evidence of some difference. Recall that equivalizing income in the German data strengthened the relationship of income and happiness, and this further supported the conclusion of some differences, and that the analytic treatment of income matters. So there is some evidence that people with higher incomes perhaps do feel less happy than some of those with lower incomes, particularly if using the categorical measurement of income. So there are limitations, of course, to this research. One of the things with household surveys, or even with self-selecting surveys as well, is that they do not capture the tails of the income distribution very well. We're excluding some of the most vulnerable populations, including people who live in nursing homes and prisons, and there may be a stronger relationship between income and happiness at the lower end of the income distribution, especially given previous findings in this area. As Kelsey has pointed out, cross-sectional studies are certainly open to misinterpretation. People tend to make causal statements from them. Higher income causes the wealthy to be less happy, and that's not what we're saying here. There's been no assessment of the counterfactual. There's no randomization. We have some control variables, but this is very much a descriptive analysis. Additionally, this is older data. There has been a lot that's happened since these data were out. We have COVID, cost of living crisis, kind of here in the UK, and so forth. So we really need an update of what's going on. I know that the American Time Use Survey has released some data from 2021. Be really interested if anyone's going to analyze that data to see if kind of similar conclusions hold and what we can find from that. So in future directions, I do hope that people will look at this question more using time use data, especially time use data from other countries, looking between countries, looking longitudinally where available, although it's really difficult to get time use data that is longitudinal, and also to see if this extends to different measures, such as life satisfaction or stress. But I do hope that people will pay attention to how income is measured and analyzed and be transparent about differences across approaches. I think also for the future, it's important to think and consider mechanisms in the relationship between individual income and happiness, including those things that I talked about in the beginning, such as expectations, generosity, on people's sense of self. Didn't say much on identity and transitioning between economic groups, but you might think about kind of doing more or less well than one's parents. Also the idea of social comparisons, which can be kind of upwards or downwards or across and may have positive or negative relationships with well-being, depending upon the degree to which people identify with other people in their reference group, and the hope and opportunities that they see for the future. But in conclusion, we conclude that individual attainment in terms of income does not always appear to equate to the attainment of individual happiness, at least in these data. Higher income could even be associated with less daily happiness, depending upon how income is measured and analyzed. And methodologically, my hope is that researchers would attend to the consequences of different ways of measuring and analyzing income and investigations of income and happiness, as well as to different ways of measuring happiness. And with that, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm very curious to hear kind of your thoughts, questions, and any reflections that you might have. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Jill, very much. So everyone, we have now an opportunity for a Q&A session. So if you would write in the chat to indicate you would like to ask a question, or you can raise your virtual hands, and then we can call on you. Either way, we're going to read out the question so it gets into the recording. Let's see here. I got to open up my participant
I'm noticing in
here.
the chat, Kelsey, that you're mentioning that Killingsworth presented as well. So I'll have to go back and look at that recording. That's great.
Yeah, nice guy too, if you haven't met him. Yeah, worth talking to him, worth checking back. So I don't see anything just yet. So I will start off with a question. And for me, I think part of the debate in the United States is also the source of income, right? So if you get maybe transfer payments versus, labor, or let's say some other, return on assets, and I think that was one of the questions in the US context, right? You have the different categories of income. So have you guys considered looking at different categories in addition to how the measure was conducted?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and interesting question. It would be great to see analyses of the different kind of categories of incomes. I'm not sure if ATIS or GSIP has that along with the time use data. GSIP might, I would imagine, and I would certainly imagine that it makes a difference, because the context of providing this income really makes a difference. If it's part of, say, a poverty alleviation program, for example, and there's a strong implementation context behind it that provides support for people kind of with different challenges that they face, versus whether it's a banker's bonus, for example, you would imagine that that's going to be a really kind of different impact and relationship with happiness.
Right. Okay. I guess I misunderstood. I thought, that the ATIS did have that, where the income was coming from. So maybe I missed that.
It does. Yeah, I can see why you might think that. It asks them to include all of these different sources of income. And it's possible that is data that's available, but I don't recall seeing it myself. So something that I would need to check on. Yeah.
I think, I just missed that. So then my question, do you have any expectation as to why income is not important? And, it has been found to be important in these other, studies by Killingsworth or by Kahneman and Deaton. And so and in fact, that it may be negative. And maybe you can also relate it to that. So it's kind of a longer question. We don't see then a relative income impact here either, it seems.
So a few things.
A positive one anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Relative income, if you do look at relative income, and this particular study doesn't include that, but I have looked at that separately, there is a relationship, although weaker, with relative income and experiences of happiness. So in ATIS, at least, you do get some relative income effects depending upon how you measure kind of relative income. Compared to Kahneman and Deaton, who did find a relationship, and compared to Killingsworth, the way that this data collected is a little bit different, at least for Kahneman and Deaton, who are using kind of measures of affect yesterday. So we would expect there to be a difference when we use time use diaries here. So I think that can explain the difference there. With Killingsworth, I would imagine that the difference has to do with the sample. So looking at the way that Killingsworth obtained his sample, it's from an online website. And I don't think that there was as much effort made to sample representatively. So you're going to get people who are happy to respond to a beep on their phone. Whereas the American Time Use Survey and GSIP are kind of really well-funded household surveys where there's a lot of effort made to capture people kind of more across the income distribution. So I think that can account for the differences there. In terms of theoretically why there's no relationship between, you looked like you were going to say something. I can stop if you like.
No, well, I was just thinking it'd be interesting to, one of the things we tried to do in Luxembourg to expand, basically moving into representativeness with an online panel, is we used the EU Silk and asked whether or not you would be willing to be contacted for an online panel. And what I'm thinking is, would it be possible to adjust, say, the ETHOS or the GSUP and ask, would you be willing to do something online? And then you can look at a subset of the sample and then maybe be able to back into the non-representative one, so that you can actually show that the differences are due to non-representativeness versus something else. Because, it has me a little bit like, I would just like to delve into that further to make sure that I really understand where the differences are coming from. And non-representativeness is such a difficult one to deal with. And so it's always, you can point to that, but if possible, it'd be great to look into it further.
Yeah, and the issue, I think, with doing that, particularly for happiness studies, is that you can't adjust for things that are not observable. So if you are, for example, kind of, selecting on the basis of people's willingness to take part, and everything about them, their motivation, their baseline levels of happiness, etc., there can be more of an effort made to kind of wait and adjust for that. But with a lot of studies, we don't know the reason why people choose to take part or not in terms of that self-selection. And it's really hard to adjust, especially for those time variable, the ones that change over time, confounders, things like motivation, personality can change over time. So we can adjust based on observable confounders, but what we really want is, like the Office for National Statistics has here, I think, a sampling frame where you randomly select from that sampling frame. You do everything you can to account for non-response. We have something called knock to nudge here, where if people don't answer the emails or the letters that you send them in areas where people aren't responding, you go knock on their doors. That kind of effort is really important, especially for understanding something like income and happiness. I just don't think an online sample is going to cut it because you don't have kind of that level of kind of representativeness there.
Yeah. So you can respond to Killingsworth and say, your work is rubbish. But
not at all.
Of course, he's a nice guy, though, so I wouldn't want to be mean. But
I think it's really important to have evidence on experience sampling, because that is really what gets at the core of what we're doing without any recall bias. But then we have to be careful about the limitations of that, especially if we're going to make conclusions about how individuals should live their lives or what policy should do in order to intervene. By saying, okay, is this something that applies to the population that I'm interested in influencing? And I think it's difficult to know when it's an online self-selecting sample. I think that's why there could potentially be differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then
we also,
sorry, go ahead.
2 questions, so I don't want to dominate here. So maybe we'll come back to my earlier question if it's okay with you, and give Joe an opportunity to, just because I feel like I'm dominating a bit. So, Joe, do you want to unmute yourself and ask yourself?
Sure. Thanks. Again, the topic is fascinating, and we've been dabbling with this topic for ages now. Starting from the early 70s. It seems to me that when we look at relationships, direct relationships between, things between age and happiness, or gender and happiness, income and happiness, we kind of miss the boat. We miss the boat because there's quite, in reality, these things interact in a very complex ways. So in the context of income, it seems to me, and there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that socioeconomic status, as well as standard of living, tends to be a much richer concept that takes into account income in addition to a whole bunch of other things. And once you complement income with these other variables, then the evidence suggests that yes, indeed, income conjoined with these other variables they do make a difference in people's lives. And because if you're really thinking about income in the context of standard of living or socioeconomic status in terms of resources, and resources tend to, contribute a lot to people's happiness. Your thoughts?
Thank you. That's a great question and a very important point. Very nice to meet you as well. I know your work well. In terms of kind of this systems and interaction, from a public health point of view, I think some of the work that's going on right now about creating complex systems models of mental health and well-being to understand how all these factors interact, not even just at an individual level, but at a community and societal level, are really interesting and really important. So if we are trying to figure out what to do to intervene in youth mental health, for example, then we would have a constellation of factors around kind of education, as well as social media consumption, thinking about the policies in place that to support their health and well-being at the school level, all of this kind of stuff. And yes, once you include, additional ingredients related to socioeconomic status, then it can make more of a difference. Income in the bank alone doesn't impact upon happiness unless it's about those thoughts related to it. Usually you would have to, consume it into something. And I've done some analyses of the English longitudinal study of aging, kind of looking at the relationship between education and subjective well-being on different measures. It's an older sample. And if you control for income, education is negatively associated with measures of well-being because the point of education is that it can give you higher income. And if you hold that constant, then it's difficult to say what the benefits are. But nevertheless, even with the other variables in this particular study, we included a host of controls, for gender, for age, for these things. Then I think, there's still showing a lack of an association. So perhaps it is the things that income allows you to have rather than income in and of itself that creates this relationship. That's what I think, but I'd be curious for your views as well.
Thank you, Laura.
I was muted. We had another real quick question. I'll just go ahead and ask from Azge Selyavuz. She says, thank you. And also wants to know if there are any differences regarding gender.
It's an important question. We didn't look at differences in gender in this particular study, but it is something that we could look at in the future, or I would encourage others to look at as well. You might imagine different kind of labor market contexts. You could have an interaction there. The focus, though, was on kind of different ways of measuring and analyzing income in this case, rather than other demographic characteristics.
Okay, so maybe back to my earlier question. Why do you think there might be a negative relationship or no relationship at all?
Yeah, so negative or no, I think it's difficult to say, and certainly we can't say from these data. Some of the studies that I mentioned in the introduction around kind of expectations or social comparisons or the costs of achievement, some of the things that people give up in order to earn a lot of income, especially the ability to spend time well. And we're looking at time use surveys here. That could be something that impacts upon the relationship. There's a model of well-being that I'm currently using. It's called the well-eye, where we talk about and think about well-being and subjective well-being in the metaphor of an eye. And kind of on the outside are the objective circumstances of people's lives, like income or any policy kind of related to happiness. And then that's all filtered through attention. And attention converts something like income into, in the middle of the eye, the outcome of happiness. So income only affects our happiness depending upon how much attention we pay to it. And this is something that I worked on with Paul Dolan and Kate Laffin at the London School of Economics. And so this kind of explains why there might be a lack of a relationship if income isn't something that we're attending to in our daily lives, right? So we're looking specifically at time use according to happiness. Well, as people go about their daily lives, perhaps they're not thinking about kind of what's in the bank. Perhaps they're thinking about what they're doing, that they're presenting in an online talk or chatting with their friends rather than their salary.
Right. And it makes sense, actually. So, if you ask financial satisfaction before life satisfaction, you have a significant decrease. And so when you prime people to think about certain subjects, they put more emphasis on those aspects. So actually, and this was kind of a related question earlier, is how happiness is asked in both surveys, although it doesn't really matter because the point isn't to compare between Germany and the United States. But if there is any sort of priming, from the previous question, although that's a detail that it's a little bit perhaps less interesting. What you could do maybe is look at, because you have the time use data, how many hours people are working, so you could see if people are in fact working a lot longer hours at the higher income levels. And then maybe so you might be able to test some of your theory about that.
That's a
Joe,
great
were you?
idea. Yeah. Perhaps we could work on
Wow.
that together. I know that there's new data, and I'm remembering that we have a folder of things that we wanted to do with the ATIS and the GSUB that we just never got around to. This was the main thing that we got around to, but especially now that there's more recent data, that could absolutely be something to look into.
And I think from the economist point of view, to sell it, it's like, it's really hard to sell that there's no relationship. So if you found, and it's super important in policy right now, right, is the focus on people at the bottom end of the distribution, and not just necessarily in happiness, think about misery. So if you instead of happiness, you looked at depression or one of the negative affect items, you might find that there is a relationship, and then you're going to reassure people that the data are meaningful, and that it's not just, I don't know, measurement error or something like that.
Yeah, and looking at the data from the ATIS, I know when Costa looked at negative affect, income did appear protective against negative affect. So it's not as if, there's nothing there. But at least in terms of positive affect, there's some question about that relationship. It's interesting that you say it's a hard sell to economists, because I'm not sure that it would be a hard sell to everyone. Certainly at the bottom end of the income distribution, income matters a lot, and these household surveys don't always capture that particularly well. But beyond that, people may not be attending to the things like income in their daily lives. It may be good news.
Yeah, well, it's just the economists are so, it's part of their identity that income matters, right? That's, what we focus on. That's our field. That's, so to show that a relationship that income doesn't matter is like attacking somebody's identity. So it's, and especially to say that it's negative, right? It means that, we've been giving bad advice for the past, 50 years or more. At this point, probably, much longer. So,
yeah, although, the counterfactual is not apparent. People with higher income could be even worse off if they didn't have that higher income, right? So it's not to say that income is necessarily something that is bad for them, because, as you've pointed out, no manipulation. We really don't know the counterfactual. They could be even worse off without that income. But yeah, I do. About the bottom end of the income distribution, I really agree with you. That's where the attention should focus, and where I think the interesting stuff is at the moment.
Or in this case, the bottom of not necessarily the income distribution, but really just focusing on misery, or ill-being, or suffering of one form, just to show that there is a relationship, and then at least income is protective.
Yes, I do think it's interesting, because part of the positive psychology movement was moving away from this idea of negative psychological functioning, and in public health as well, the idea was to move away from just studying kind of mental health disorders. And now it seems like there's a bit of a turn back to focus on misery again, after we've been prioritizing positive functioning for so long. I'm working on a paper with Gallup, kind of looking at the determinants and distribution of misery, paper about using Gallup about that. But yeah, it is something about what we can do.
I generally agree. I agree. And interesting that with the Gallup question. So we have another question from Pasquale, and we're also approaching time, so I'll monitor myself. So Pasquale de Muro asked, I'll just to be quick, is income related with income, or rather wealth, which is maybe more relevant? So I guess this might be, is happiness related to income, or more with wealth?
We didn't have wealth, as far as I'm aware, in the ATIS, maybe in the GSUP, but we didn't measure it. Have, as I mentioned before, done some work with the English longitudinal study of aging, and in ELSA, wealth was much more consistently associated with subjective well-being and happiness than was income, and perhaps because wealth is more stable, but I think it's less common to measure it and analyze it in that way. Certainly that's something that's important when we think about more societal level factors around kind of wealth and equality as well. But I think in theory, in some earlier studies, wealth is more consistently associated.
So we're approaching the end. So if anyone has, any last burning questions, I think we can go for it. Otherwise, maybe time to shut down. Looks
Thank
like
you,
we're
everyone.
good. Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Laura, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone also for the excellent discussion at the end. Wonderful questions. Sounds like some future research is being planned as well. Laura, we hope that you can come to our conference next August. It's just a short trip for you across from England. So to all of you as well, if you are interested again, we'll be sending out that information quickly as soon as this is uploaded to our YouTube site, along with that membership trial option as well. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you, Kelsey, for introducing her and for facilitating the Q&A. And we hope to see you all soon, upcoming in Rotterdam and in our future webinars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.